New alarm bells over climate change. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. Some of the world's leading climate scientists are talking about global warming in some unprecedented ways right now. And here to talk about that is Dr. Gillian Gregg. She's a professor at Oregon State University, which has done some landmark research on all this. And Dr. Gregg, what are the scientists finding right now?
Okay, well, there's a group called the Alliance of World Scientists, and we found that there's all these reports going around, like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change just came out with their most recent report with all these dire warnings to humanity. But this is an enormous collation of all scientific data from the last 5 to 7 years, and it's then summarized in these 3 enormous volumes. And then there's a summary for policymakers. But our message is more, we summarized a lot of data, very data intensive, into one article that is only 1,500 words, and it's meant to be a direct message from the scientists to the people that anybody could read. And so what we've done is we've summarized 31 vital signs of the planet, all into one location. And the idea is the IPCC put out this dire message that we have to act, and we have to have 45% of 2010 emissions by 2030, or there's gonna be these major consequences. But how do we know if we're making any progress? There's all these reports and all these ways that you can see what's going on. And what we've done is we collated all these vital signs into one place. So there's 2
sets. And one of the vital signs, I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the vital signs has to do, for example, with carbon dioxide emissions and concentration. And you found that April 2021 was the highest concentration of carbon dioxide in the history of this record being kept?
Exactly, yeah. It's an ever increasing level of carbon dioxide. There's been no pause since we began measuring it in the 1950s.
Has there been any pause in any of the indicators, say thanks to COVID-19 and the fact that so much production around the world was slowed down?
That was very, very exciting to be able to be in the midst of COVID and have something to look at actually as a scientist, like what is the actual impact there? And we did, there was a 17% reduction in the CO2 emissions during those first 3 months of the shutdown. But as countries began opening back up over the course of the year, that came to an average of only a 9% reduction. We also saw that massive reduction in the GDP and a massive reduction in the airline flights. So all of these things went down, but then since the reopening, everything is bouncing up, and so it's not having a long-term impact. But what is really important to notice in the numbers for that COVID year when we did see a reduction in emissions is that emissions is a really different figure than the actual atmospheric CO2 concentrations that I've said have never paused. So even though we had a 9% reduction in emissions over that over a year, 91% of our emissions are still adding to the CO2 pool in the atmosphere. And so it still was growing with no pause whatever. That is why you hear scientists saying we've got to get to net zero emissions, because we need that atmospheric CO2 pool to stop rising and just completely level off. And once it levels off, we're still at a level that's too high for the Earth, and we need to go into drawdown and pull those CO2 concentrations down back to 350 parts per million. So
and yet, even if we were able to cut back on industrial emissions, there's still emissions, say, from livestock. There's also a detriment to the atmosphere we're causing by the destruction of rainforests. So I guess the message is it's not just emissions that contribute to the dangers that we're facing, right?
Right. We need to reduce in all different aspects of the impacts that we're having on our environment. The ruminant population, they emit a lot of methane, and methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas. And it's something that as individuals, people always ask me, what can they do as an individual? Maybe you can't change your country and whether they're subsidizing fossil fuels, but ruminant populations we have more biomass in cattle on the earth than we have of all humans and wildlife combined. And on a personal level, you don't have to eat no meat, but you could eat less meat, and that would have an immediate impact on your own personal carbon footprint. And there are personal carbon footprint calculators that you can look at the EPA and sort these things out if you like.
In general, is industry doing a better job around the globe now, at least of being able to track the carbon emissions that they pump into the atmosphere, or is this just such a steep climb that maybe it doesn't even matter?
I think tracking is financial. We know how many barrels of oil are sold and how many train cars of coal are sold. And so we know if someone spent money on them, then they're gonna burn them and put them into the atmosphere. So tracking is pretty straightforward. Reductions are not, we aren't seeing reductions.
All right, and let's assume that we don't see the necessary reductions by 2030 that the scientists are calling for. What does our planet, what does our atmosphere then look like?
Okay, so the idea is so right now our atmosphere is going up at 3 parts per million CO2 per year. And as soon as we get to 450 parts per million CO2, then we're gonna be at 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So it's a direct one-to-one relationship. You put more CO2 in the air, as the sunlight hits the earth and re-radiates and tries to leave the earth, it gets trapped in by these greenhouse gases that have these absorbing bonds, like if you're mountain biking. So they re-radiate that heat and re-radiate back to earth. And so the more CO2 we have, the warmer the earth is. It's straight one-to-one. So when we get to 450 parts per million, we're gonna be at 2 degrees Celsius. And at that point, we're expecting to cross various different tipping points beyond which we are not going. It won't matter any longer how much we are emitting, because the earth can go into these positive feedback loops or accentuating feedback loops where some warming causes even more warming, and that is continuing separate from how much we actually emit. So we don't want to get into that range.
And of course, 2 degrees Celsius, that's a pretty dramatic rise. I think it's 8 to 10 feet in terms of the ocean levels rising in so many cities, particularly in the United States, that have toxic waste dumps and all sorts of other problems right near the coast. They are essentially going to be in some major trouble. You mentioned some of the changes again that people can take personally in terms of less meat consumption. What are other things though that we can do either individually or collectively that you think are realistic within the next 10 years?
Well, the big thing that's going on now is that states and nations are in a race for who can be provide 100% renewable electricity to their populations. So whereas one idea is to conserve, as your appliances go out of date, and you know that's what's going on is we need to change all of our use to electricity, so that when 100% renewable electricity comes to our home, we are no longer using the fossil fuels. So you can put solar, if you're a homeowner, you can put solar on your roof, you can move to electric vehicles, and you can change your hot water and your heat systems to heat pumps. And those will be electric heat pumps, and so we'd be using renewable energy for those in the future.
And Dr. Gregg, for people who want to read the 1,500-word report themselves, where can they find it?
Just Google bioscience, world scientists warning to humanity, and it'll pop up and you can read the whole thing. It's really easy read. It's 1,500 words and it's very direct, not just full of scientific jargon. So.
In other words, it's written, I assume, then for the average person out there. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to have an advanced degree in climate change to be able to understand it. Are there also some of the recommendations in that particular report so that people who, in addition to the various steps they want to take, in addition to trying to understand what the problem is, that there's some concrete steps that they can take based on going to that site and going to that report?
The recommendations in the report are at a national and an international level. So it'd be more on things that you would want to vote for it, rather than things you can personally do. So they're larger level impacts. And so what we need is right now, 22% of all of the fossil fuels that are emitted do have a carbon price associated with them. So we're advocating that we have to have a price on carbon. These things are being put into the atmosphere. we need to pay not only to burn them, but also the impacts on the extreme climate events that they're causing. We need those things covered in cost also.
Finally, Dr. Greg, you're right in the middle of all this. Is it very depressing to be a scientist, to be looking at the data and be able to be so familiar with it and realize, I mean, you're screaming at the top of your lungs, the scientific community, and it seems like so much of the world just either isn't hearing it or deliberately tuning it out?
That's going to vary between scientists. For me, I started in 1990 when no one was listening. You are interviewing us. This is on TV. This is the broadcast newscasters when they talk about extreme events. Now the attribution science, the science of climate attribution is now real time. And so as the extreme events come out, the science is coming out. So there's not the year lag time. So the actual newscasters are explaining about anthropogenic climate change at the same time as the extreme events are happening. So I see a lot of progress. I know also the cuts that we need to make, if we just cut by 6 to 7% per year, you do the math, that comes to that comes to halving our emissions every decade. And so if we have our emissions every decade for 3 decades, we really will be at net zero.
Yeah.
And so I am more of the opposite. It is sad that we are at business as usual, but if you play out the numbers and you play out the news, I think it still can happen.
And I think you do have to be an optimist, otherwise this can just drive you crazy. In any case, Dr. Gillian Gregg, professor at Oregon State University, thanks for doing this, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.